There were some assignments that, for various reasons, were a little riskier than usual. Being the medication nurse was one of them, because they had to confront patients suspected of tonguing their meds, which then required that they got close enough to look into their disgruntled mouths.
Now it's time for Puppets, Pupils, and Producers, a story of mind over matter.
On the mad side, a patient's capacity to make decisions for himself fell into three categories. The first, and the one assessed most often, was his capacity to consent to treatment for his mental illness. The second involved treatment for medical conditions, and the third focused on his ability to manage his money. Since patients diagnosed with major mental illnesses such as schizophrenia often lost touch with reality and lacked insight into their symptoms and circumstances, it wasn't unusual for them to refuse treatment. Whereas the capacity of a patient who willingly accepted treatment was assumed, when the truth was that he didn't understand the risks or benefits either. If he refused treatment for his mental illness and couldn't provide a reasonable understanding of the consequences of his decision, he would be deemed incapable to consent to his treatment, and after he was given the opportunity to appeal the decision, substitute consent from a close family member or a government-appointed guardian would be sought. Despite being deemed incapable by his psychiatrist, the same patient might be assessed as capable by his medical doctor, and therefore he could make decisions regarding his physical health. In the same way, his capacity to understand the risks and benefits of treatments for his medical condition was assumed, and unless he was suffering from an unstable condition, his refusal would not be challenged. Unless he had his own money, the patient received a monthly personal needs allowance, which most often was spent on cigarettes, delivery pizza, and junk food. If the money was gone within days, and he started begging for a bite or became a cigarette bumming nuisance, he'd be assessed and deemed as incapable to manage his finances, and after a formal process, he'd receive his monthly allowance in allotments. Since an incapable patient was forced to take medication that he didn't want, compliance was an ongoing issue. But one of the biggest problems involved the solution itself, because if and when his mental status improved, he'd challenge his incapacity, and the cycle of his refusing treatment would begin again. Another version of the same saga involved patients who pretended they were swallowing their pills when they weren't. While most tried but failed, others succeeded because they'd perfected doing almost undetectable maneuvers with their tongues. Others actually liked taking some of their pills, but not others. So he'd pick out the ones he liked first, and after he swallowed them, he'd tongue the rest. What he did with the pills he didn't swallow depended on whether he was suicidal or stupid, because keeping them instead of flushing them risked their discovery during a search of his cell. The medication nurse held the keys for the medication cart and passed them off to the next medication nurse. They did not share them or put them in a drawer, but in their pocket, because like the money in a cashier's till, they were responsible for what came in and what went out of the medication cart during their shift. There were some assignments that, for various reasons, were a little riskier than usual. Being the medication nurse was one of them, because they had to confront patients suspected of tonguing their meds, which then required that they got close enough to look into their disgruntled mouths. To do the job well, one had to accurately pour a little bit of water into a 1-ounce cup while they watched the movements of the patient's tongue like a hawk. Behaviors such as sorting their pills, not talking, and making a beeline for his cell were suspect as well. However, his ruse wouldn't last forever because his deteriorating mental status would betray him, resulting in his pills getting crushed or to his getting switched to a long-acting injectable version of the same drug. Depending on the patient, giving a scheduled injection involves several staff, 1 to do the injecting and 2 or 3 to assure the patient that whether they cooperated or not, it was going to happen. Others chose the hard way, which required physical restraint, but most often it was expected. So the conversation began when he was still in his cell, and instead of 2 or 3, the medication nurse would be accompanied by 4, 5, or 6 staff. At that juncture, he'd be given the option of presenting his hands through his cracked cell door, followed by being guided and held against the wall on the opposing side of the corridor, where his hip would be respectfully exposed, cleansed, and injected. If he still didn't cooperate, he'd be extricated, injected, and returned to his cell with amazing precision. While being big and strong was a definite asset, the staff who were best at extricating patients were the ones who remained cool-headed, because they didn't take the patient's threat, spit, or punch personally. As with most medications, antipsychotics had side effects that could be life-threatening, and using them long-term could result in irreversible conditions. Many of the side effects occurred within days to weeks and caused a level of discomfort or distress that required an additional pill or injection to ease them. If a patient's deteriorating mental status didn't reveal his noncompliance, his lack of observable side effects just might. There were, however, a few side effects that didn't respond to a pill or injection, and because they also involved significant risks to their health, they were treated with dietary restrictions, despite their protestations, because nutrition fell between the proverbial cracks of capacity and consent legislation. The drinkers suffered from psychogenic polydipsia, which caused them to drink life-threatening amounts of water. To keep the drinkers alive, they were weighed every hour. If they didn't gain more than 2 kilograms, they were rewarded with a cup of water. If they were stable enough to leave the unit, they'd be able to buy anything they wanted at the canteen, except items with a blue dot. The eaters gained weight at a phenomenal rate, which then made them susceptible to developing diabetes and obesity-related problems later. To keep them alive, they were put on a low-calorie diet, and if they were stable enough to leave the unit, they'd be able to buy anything they wanted at the canteen with a yellow dot. Lastly, there was a group referred to as the chokers. Considered a disorder, dysphagia described an impaired functioning or coordination of the processes involved with swallowing, which may include one or a combination of issues. Whether it was silent, subtle, or resulted in a spewing cough, failing to swallow properly could cause a patient to aspirate what should have gone into his stomach, leading to dehydration, malnutrition, pneumonia, and possible death. To keep the chokers alive, everything they drank was thickened, and they ate a pureed diet. If they were good to go to the canteen, they could purchase anything with a red sticker. Not surprisingly, the drinkers became obsessed with fluids they could not drink. The eaters became obsessed with the foods they could not eat. And the chokers became obsessed with fluids and foods that weren't the consistency of cream of wheat. As a result, Taking patients to the canteen became another one of the riskier assignments because no one, regardless of their age or their supposed understanding of the risks and benefits, wanted to be told they couldn't have what they wanted. In Cassie's mind, it was a double standard, since she chose to drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, and had an undeniable weakness for kettle-cooked potato chips, all of which she knew were not good for her physical health, yet no one restricted her access to those items. The fact that their guzzling, gobbling, and gagging were possibly caused by the medications they were forced to take also made her question whether her efforts as a nurse were all for naught, because even the best case scenario of her patient leaving the mental health system meant he'd likely become reliant on the medical system. Charlie was an elderly schizophrenic patient who could have left years ago, but was one of those guys who'd stop taking his medication as soon as the topic of being transferred came up. He didn't want to leave, not just because he had no family left and nowhere to go, but because he, like too many of the patients, liked it there. So when he was diagnosed with dysphagia, he clearly stated he didn't want to eat goop for the rest of his days and would rather risk the effects of aspirating and his possible death, which created a conundrum that later evoked an investigation after he stole a sausage on a bun and would have died had the responding nurse not been a skilled fisherman used to retrieving hooks from the gullets of fish. But the results of the investigation didn't matter, at least not to Charlie, because 3 weeks later he choked on a peanut butter sandwich, which he secretly got from a patient in exchange for a cigarette.
Hola, hola, pupils! If you're enjoying my fictional self-healing series, I'd love your feedback. I'd also love it if you'd feed the algorithm by following me and liking the post. And if you're stuck in the mindset and frequency of a puppet, and you'd like an energy session with me, please reach out and we'll make it happen.